Hello, my name is Brian Rouleau. I'm an associate professor in the history department at Texas A&M. And today I wanted to talk about the very consequential Louisiana Purchase of 1803. When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, he came to power in a world ravaged by the wars of the Napoleonic age. Navigating that complex situation, characterized as it was by nearly constant warfare, both on the European continent and the world's oceans, was one of America's great challenges. The strategy settled upon by Jefferson and his Democratic Republican allies was one of conflict avoidance. They sought to evade direct entanglement with European states, which might draw them into an expensive and destructive war. Therefore, one of Jefferson's first acts as president was to shrink dramatically the size of the federal military establishment. This would save the government money while also reducing the tax burdens imposed on ordinary citizens. But in addition to those practical benefits, Jefferson's dismantling of the armed forces was also an ideological project. Jefferson claimed to be highly suspicious of what at the time were called standing armies and navies. He thought that a large military was an invitation to dictatorship. They could be, in the wrong hands, a tool used to crush the liberties of the people through ruthless oppression. War, Jefferson also saw, led to the amassing of large national debts, which could bankrupt both governments and their citizens. And more generally, Jefferson believed that military adventurism abroad could be used as a means to amass decision-making power in the hands of a single person, the president, when that power actually belonged closer to the people, vested in offices more directly responsible to voters. But even if he sought to avoid war with Europe, Jefferson still hoped to take advantage of any opportunities that the Napoleonic conflicts might present. America, Jefferson believed, had the potential to, and I quote, fatten on the follies of the old world. In other words, there might be ways that America could play European mistakes to its own advantage. Perhaps the most famous of these opportunities presented itself in the expansive territory of Louisiana. Louisiana, a broad swath of land west of the Mississippi River, had originally been claimed by France, but by the end of the 18th century had fallen into the hands of the Spanish. Until, that is, the year 1800, when, by the terms of a secret pact of retrocession between Napoleon and the King of Spain, France resumed control of its former colony on mainland North America. For the United States, this triggered the diplomatic equivalent of a 5-alarm fire. When details of Louisiana's transfer back into French hands leaked, the American State Department hit the panic button. Louisiana, when possessed by a relatively weak power like Spain, had never presented a problem. Many Americans assumed that eventually Spain's derelict and decaying empire would crumble and sort of naturally fall into the lap of the United States. But France was a different animal entirely. Napoleon and his seemingly invincible army now had a foothold on the North American continent. They could use their position along the Mississippi River to block the westward expansion of the United States and thereby drag the country into expensive wars designed to dislodge French forces. This was the nightmare scenario for Jefferson. A militarized border that split the continent of North America right down the middle, such that the United States would be forced to field large armies and navies to defend against this clear and present danger that was Napoleon. Particularly vexing to American policymakers was the prospect of losing access to the vital port of New Orleans. Situated at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it was, in an era before reliable overland roads, the primary means by which American farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains shipped their produce into the national and international marketplace. Americans feared that without reliable access to New Orleans and the transportation network that was the Mississippi River and its tributaries more generally, western states full of farmers desperate to turn a profit from the sale of their harvests might secede from the United States and seek more economically favorable arrangements with the French government that now controlled the region. Without firing a shot, France could cut America into eastern and western halves, further weakening the young republic. For all these reasons, Jefferson's priority was to secure American control of New Orleans at least, and as much of Louisiana as possible. The administration sent negotiators to Paris with instructions to purchase New Orleans for $10 million. Expecting to buy New Orleans and little else, the Americans were understandably shocked when the French Minister of Foreign Affairs instead offered to sell the entirety of the territory, roughly 827,000 square miles of land, for $15 million. That's roughly $300 million in today's currency. Now, why had the French decided to unload Louisiana onto the United States at the bargain bin price of about 3 cents per acre? It turned out that America had become the beneficiary of French military catastrophe in the Caribbean. A massive slave rebellion in the colony of Saint-Domingue, known today as the nation of Haiti, shaded here in red, led to the famous black general Toussaint Louverture successfully routed an enormous French army that had been sent to conquer the country and restore slavery on its lucrative sugar and coffee plantations. A combination of heroic resistance on the part of black rebels and the ravages of yellow fever among the French invaders sent the French expeditionary force down to defeat. Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies, an enraged Napoleon was heard to scream. With the reconquest of Haiti now a lost cause, the control of Louisiana appeared pointless. The entire reason behind France's acquisition of the territory from Spain was that it would serve as a sort of breadbasket for the Caribbean sugar colony of Saint-Domingue. It would grow the food, provide the meat, and supply the wood required to feed slaves and produce sugar on Saint-Domingue. None of it was necessary thanks to the tactical genius of Louverture and his rebel army. It was now pointless for the French to retain Louisiana. Napoleon's new strategy was to sell the entirety of the territory to the United States. This would produce 3 benefits. First and foremost, it was a real estate transaction meant to raise the money France required to fund a new round of wars on the European continent. Second, it might help to promote a more lasting, positive, and productive diplomatic relationship between the United States and France. And third, Napoleon calculated that in the long term, Louisiana would enrich and enlarge America to the point where it might eventually become a power capable of defeating his hated British adversaries. And so by April of 1803, a treaty had been signed transferring France's claim to the Louisiana Territory to the United States. An expanse of land so large that the French foreign minister, when asked about its boundaries, could give no precise answer, cryptically claiming that, quote, "You have made a noble bargain for yourselves, and I suppose you will make the most of it." The total cost of the transaction was $15 million, no small amount for the fledgling United States. Indeed, this figure was more than the total federal budget that year. With the stroke of a pen in Paris, however, the size of the country had doubled. Once the treaty arrived in the United States for ratification, some small debate developed. Jefferson himself was unsure about the deal's constitutionality, but material interest ultimately trumped political principle. Ultimately, the Senate ratified the agreement over the objections of the Federalist Party, who thought it was a waste of money, of which the United States had too little, on land of which the United States already had too much. As a result of the Louisiana Purchase, America secured title to the immensely valuable port of New Orleans, which opened the entire Mississippi River Valley, one of the most fruitful stretches of agricultural land on the planet, to eventual American domination. It would be the source of U.S. food security, itself a facet of national security, for generations to come. With the purchase of so much fertile land, Jefferson believed the U.S. could escape what was known as the Malthusian trap, a supposed law of nature, which posited that a growing population would always increase beyond its ability to feed itself. In addition, the arrangement formally transferred sovereignty in the region into U.S. hands. With handshakes, salutes, and the firing of cannons, the French flag came down in New Orleans, and up was raised the Stars and Stripes. A powerful European rival had been removed from the North American continent, seemingly clearing the way for continued westward expansion. Jefferson expected that land to become what he called America's, quote, empire of liberty. This was, as he saw it, an act of bloodless conquest, whereby small and independent yeoman farmers peacefully moved west to avoid the drudgery of industrial wage labor in the cities of the East. And in so doing, they would plant the seeds of democratic self-government across the North American continent. As Jefferson saw it, quote, those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. The worst curse that could befall the United States would be for it to become a largely urban and industrial nation populated by wage laborers dependent upon wealthy capitalists for their daily bread, and thus politically subservient to the whims of the richest and most powerful Americans. That was not democracy. That was oligarchy and aristocracy, the very set of conditions the American Revolution had aimed to destroy in the first place. The Louisiana Purchase was, in Jefferson's imagination, a hedge against that grim possibility, the descent into a tyranny of the wealthiest few. It was meant as a gift to future generations of small or yeoman farmers who could remain self-sufficient on their own independent farms, carved out of the territory America had acquired in 1803. But the Louisiana Purchase, as Jefferson imagined it to be, often differed from reality. Textbooks from the 19th and 20th centuries also helped to propagate a mythical version of the Purchase, wherein American expansion, in contrast with European colonization, was a benign, bloodless, and harmless series of legal arrangements and real estate transactions. Kings and queens of the Old World engaged in brutal acts of imperialistic theft, this story went, while the United States, by contrast, merely purchased land to become its rightful owner. Afterwards, pioneering American farmers transformed a wilderness at the center of the continent into some of the world's most productive agricultural zones. The reality, as we now know, was very different than Jefferson's fantasy version of American benevolence. Jefferson's so-called Empire of Liberty was rapidly dominated by slaveholders who force-marched thousands of unfree African Americans into the region to carve the land up into slave plantations producing cotton, sugar, and other cash crops. Jefferson failed to see that despite his fear of industrialization, he'd actually ensured the growth of enormous plantations, factories in the fields that concentrated money and power in the hands of a very few aristocratic slave owners. Not to mention the northern capitalists whose more literal factories processed Western and Southern raw materials and whose banks grew rich off the sweat and blood of enslaved people. There was a dark irony then to Louisiana's origins as an American province. The heroic struggles of rebellious slaves in Haiti had provided a pretext for Napoleon to sell the Mississippi River region to the United States. In winning their own freedom, Haiti's slaves had inadvertently consigned millions of black Americans to a lifetime of suffering beneath the overseer's lash. Jefferson, meanwhile, repaid Haiti with an embargo that attempted to economically strangle the infant nation. A country that had once been America's second largest trading partner was pushed into a state characterized by endemic poverty and instability, thanks in part to America's post-purchase punitive actions and sanctions. The slaveholders steering U.S. foreign policy believed that Haiti needed to be destroyed for the dangerous example that its rebel slaves, pictured here, set for America's own black population. U.S. slavery, which many observers in the 1780s had predicted and planned for the demise or extinction of, was rejuvenated by the Louisiana Purchase. Indeed, even slaveholders distant from the new Louisiana Territory profited from the transaction. With New Orleans now an American city, it became the most important site for slave transshipment in the country. A massive domestic slave trade emerged, taking quote-unquote surplus African Americans from the Chesapeake and places east, and rerouting them through New Orleans, up the Mississippi, and into the hellish slave labor camps sprouting up within lands newly acquired by President Jefferson. Hundreds of thousands of black families were eventually separated as husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters found themselves sold to all points on the map pictured here. Simply put, the Louisiana Purchase, along with technological advances in the growing and processing of cotton, the cotton gin, deeply entrenched slavery in the economy and politics of the United States, triggering decades of sectional strife, immeasurable human misery, and eventual civil war. And of course, there was one more dark or malevolent dimension to the Louisiana Purchase, and that dealt with the fate of Native Americans. France merely sold the United States its claim to Louisiana. The land itself was inhabited and controlled overwhelmingly by Indians. They had not participated in the negotiating process. They had not consented to the sale of their ancestral homelands. And many refused to recognize French or American authorities who argued that a piece of paper signed in Paris had power over their lives. To them, Louisiana was not French, Spanish, or American. It wasn't even Louisiana. It was Natchez land, Pawnee land, Mandan land, Lakota land. And this was made abundantly clear by the Lewis and Clark exploratory expedition, which, upon its return in 1806, reported on the dizzying diversity of Native American claims to the interior of the North American continent. Now, to Americanize, these Indians were little more than savages, with no firm legal title to the land they occupied. To Indians, the Americans were trespassers, at best sources of trade goods and new technology, but with no legitimate claim to ownership over the region. Part of Jefferson's eventual plan was to use at least a portion of the newly purchased territory to create a large federally managed Indian reservation. As the president said, this vast expanse of territory might be, and I quote, the means of tempting all our Indians on the east side of the Mississippi to remove to the west. This would be a territory where various tribes could be gathered and instructed in the so-called arts of civilization, the instruction very similar to that depicted here. These arts of civilization included agriculture, industry, literacy, law, and Christianity. As Jefferson said to a visiting delegation of Indians, "We wish to see you possessed of property and protecting it by regular laws. In time, you will be as we are, and you will become one people with us. Your blood will mix with ours and will spread with ours over this great land." He never bothered to consider either the worth of Indian culture on its own terms or the fact that native peoples already believed themselves to be civilized. Jefferson's hope was to accomplish all of this peacefully, preferably through negotiation, but also through the exploitation of Indian indebtedness to traders and other officials licensed to barter with Native Americans. By advancing piles of goods on credit, the administration, as Jefferson confessed, could use that leverage to compel the transfer of territory. As Jefferson said, when these debts get beyond what individuals can pay, Indians become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. A more accurate map of the Louisiana Purchase, therefore, might acknowledge the thousands of smaller transactions that took place as Native groups were forced to sell ancestral lands to resolve legal claims stemming from unequal and uneven economic exchange. It would also acknowledge the role the purchase played in facilitating the dispossession of the Cherokees and other southeastern Indian nations forcibly relocated along the many trails of tears that terminated in the new federal Indian territory of present-day Oklahoma, itself a part of the Louisiana Purchase. Greed and exploitation therefore set the stage for relentless conflict between American colonizers and indigenous peoples. We might then suggest that the actual purchase price of Louisiana was far more than $15 million. One modern estimate places the true cost into the tens of billions of dollars. Decades of war to dislodge Indians cost many times more than the original sale price, not to mention a more recent string of court settlements between the United States government and the various Native groups who have sued over the theft of land and the federal government's mismanagement of water and mineral rights. Most Americans at the time, however, chose not to dwell on those ugly truths. Instead, they memorialized the purchase with images like this. In this early American idealization of the recently acquired city of New Orleans, an eagle soars above what we today know as the French Quarter, grasping a banner that reads, "Under my wings, everything flourishes." Such was the fantasy. A closer look at that prosperity, however, reveals its true costs. Costs that perhaps cannot be measured in dollars alone. There was a moral or ethical price paid for destroying Native cultures and enslaving black families, a bill of sale that remains past due to this day.